Welcome back. It's Daryl and Jim here. And just to orient you, we're obviously in between McPherson's Ridge and Seminary Ridge, similar to the ground that we held earlier today. Daryl's going to give us a bit of an overview of the afternoon fighting, and then we're going to talk a bit about the social context, what political beliefs and ideologies propelled the men on the ground on July the 1st.
Or maybe didn't propel the men on the ground,
as
the case may be, because this is a very interesting intersection of two different worlds. But just to go back just a little bit to the fighting with Iverson's brigade earlier in the day, there's a lull in the fighting that precedes this final assault on Seminary Ridge. Now we're getting into the afternoon hours, 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you still have Union forces holding steady on Seminary Ridge. And all the while, the 12th Corps, the 3rd Corps, the 5th and the 6th Corps, the 2nd Corps are all making their way towards Gettysburg and the high ground that had been picked out by John Reynolds and then O.O. Howard and then approved by Winfield Hancock. A very, very strong position across town where the United States Army is going to set up their final defensive position, the famous fishhook.
And that, of course, is exactly what these Union soldiers wanted.
Exactly what they're doing.
The morning.
Yeah, they're buying time with bodies, and the Confederates are trying to push through. They're trying to get to the other side of town. They're trying to control this road network, and they're trying to push the 1st and the 11th Corps back on those forces that are coming up the road. But it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, give or take. The famous attack from the 26th North Carolina as part of Johnston Pettigrew's brigade is full in swing on just the other side of Herbst Woods here. To the left, Brockenborough's brigade is pressing Stone's brigade, the Bucktail brigade, and then across the road back very near where Iverson's attack took place, Junius Daniel is exerting pressure along the railroad cut area, and eventually about 3:30 or so, the Union line on McPherson's Ridge begins to disintegrate, and the retreat is ordered back to that prepared position. That barricade of rails is back over here on the seminary grounds that had been built by Gabriel Paul earlier in the day. So this is an orderly retreat. You would have seen Union soldiers marching by the flank, very orderly across this field. They would march by the flank by companies. They would stop. They would go back into line and fire a volley. A very orderly retreat back into this position. And on the other side of the ridge, we've got the follow-up attack preparing. And I think there's some pretty interesting stories over there in thinking about who these guys are.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we often don't think about, I think, when we're on the battlefield, is what exactly propelled the men into the ranks. And I think a lot about morale, esprit de corps on the ground, but these are pretty complex and contradictory
very much
political ideologies that we can see on the ground here. So I guess explain a bit about maybe some of these men were secessionists and some weren't. So
by and large, Robert E. Lee's army is made up of what historians have identified as marching masters. Most of these men are from the plantation districts. However, there are some exceptions, and those exceptions really draw out the complexity of pre-war Southern society. And here in this final attack being delivered by Dorsey Pender's division, and in this area being led by Alfred Scales' North Carolina Brigade off to the north, and then where we're standing, Abner Perrin or Sam McCowan's old South Carolina Brigade, Maxie Gregg's brigade, fighting in this area just in front of the seminary building itself. They come from very different parts of the South. Scales' men, except for one regiment, are made up of mountaineers. They're men from either the Piedmont of North Carolina or the western mountains of North Carolina. And these men had been slow to come around to supporting the Confederacy. Their market connections weren't that strong to the coastal planters. The regiments lived in fairly isolated small communities. Rutherfordtown, North Carolina, the 34th North Carolina, several companies from Rutherfordton, a small community and not very involved with that plantation economy. On the other hand, Abner Perrin's men are from South Carolina. They are some of the hottest secessionists in the entire Confederate Army. You've got where we're standing right now is the position held by the 1st South Carolina, which means something, right? These numbers tell you something about these regiments.
Early to enlist.
The early to enlist. And the 1st South Carolina is the first regiment from South Carolina to volunteer to serve in the Provisional Army of the Confederate States. And they have some really interesting characters within their ranks, including their first commissary, a guy named Leonidas Sprott, who was the editor of the Charleston Mercury, one of the hottest secessionist newspapers in the entire South. And Sprott had in 1860 been advocating for the reopening of the African slave trade. So you've got secessionist men who were very dedicated to the cause of the South, which was the cause of slavery and maintaining that system and expanding that system in Sprott's view to enrich the men who were in the ranks of the 1st South Carolina. One of the most famous memoirs of the entire war is written by a guy named Barry Benson. He's in the 1st South Carolina. He doesn't serve. He's wounded at Chancellorsville. He's not here at Gettysburg, but his brother is, and in his memoir he includes his brother's letters about what's happening in the 1st South Carolina. And we'll talk about that once we get into the action itself. But we have a lot of information about these guys, and we know a lot about their social background. The 14th South Carolina is also in this brigade, believe it or not. Washington Muller's son was in the 14th South Carolina. Well, who's Washington Muller, you might ask? Well, if we turned around, we're not going to right now, but if you turned around, you could look at the school that Washington Muller attended.
Right.
He was a Lutheran pastor who was trained at the Gettysburg Seminary and who goes to South Carolina and just north of Columbia starts an academy, and he's teaching in this academy where his son attended, who joins the 14th South Carolina. It is most likely that some of his students were in the ranks of the 14th South Carolina, and they are the men who literally stormed the seminary building itself. So there are a lot of interconnections here. The seminary itself was a place where you had an abolitionist president and Southern students who were very much pro-slavery in their attitudes.
And I think what this demonstrates is that if we think of things in monolithic terms, we find out that they're not true.
Yeah.
That in fact, on the ground, the view is much more complex.
The view is much more complex. All we have to do is go right next door to Scales, North Carolina Brigade, and look at the 34th, the 38th, the 16th, the 22nd. Those are all mountain regiments.
Right.
Those are all regiments that are recruited either from the Piedmont or the mountains. And that means something. We know about East Tennessee unionism. Right. The mountain areas of North Carolina were unionist in many ways. And these men who are in Scales Brigade had been pushed into the Army. Now, contrast in the spring of 1862. So you contrast that with the 1st South Carolina.
Right.
These guys are organized, and some of these companies in the 1st South Carolina are Minutemen companies, which had been organized in 1859 in response to John Brown's raid. Most of these men come from districts in South Carolina that had been that were 70 or more % enslaved persons.
Sure.
And so they're organizing these community defense groups. And 3 of the companies of the 1st South Carolina are in military service or proto-military service in the fall of 1859 and continue in their organization. They're organized in January of 1861. They're at Fort Sumter, and they go all the way through the war, and definitely some of the diehards of the Confederate Army, some of the best fighters in the Confederate Army. Right next door to them, you've got men who fought very well. Scales Brigade had a strong military reputation, which says something about the cohesion. You think about the ways that these units held together. There are things that are throwing these people apart. The politics of the North Carolinians. A lot of these guys are Holden Peace Party guys. There are rumors in the camp of Scales Brigade in May of 1863 that North Carolina had gone back into the Union. The Peace Party had won, and they were going back into the Union.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, again, something that's incredibly important for us to understand. And there is this broader esprit de corps that I think guides Lee's army.
Yeah, absolutely.
They believe fiercely, I think, in the leadership. They believe in the execution of the war. But again, the soldier on the ground might very well be writing home letters that he's a lot more trepidatious than we might otherwise think, or as you said, or diehard, diehard rebel.
The letter that you read earlier today about this growing sense of disillusionment with the experience of being in the Army and the experience of the violence of combat is certainly coming to play in the lives of a couple of soldiers from the 34th North Carolina, George Huntley and Thomas Cotton, both men who had been elevated to commissioned officers' positions after the Battle of Chancellorsville, were beginning to express this war weariness, they're saying that they don't believe that they're going to make it through the rest of the war, and for George Huntley, that's absolutely true. He's mortally wounded somewhere here on the field on July 1st. Huntley makes it through to the Wilderness Campaign, but is mortally wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness.
And these are men too who are hearing back from home.
Yes.
Western North Carolina, all the hardships that they're experiencing.
Right.
In South Carolina, it might be the upheaval in the plantation complex, the
right.
number of enslaved persons who are fleeing,
yeah.
The uncertainty that plantation mistresses are feeling,
yeah.
the upheaval that they are hearing from home while they're, in some cases, hundreds of miles removed.
Yeah.
It's extremely hard for these men.
And when you try to read that, you start thinking about what buy-in these guys in Perrin's brigade have to that system versus the buy-in that the guys from the mountain regions have.
Right.
And one of the things that happens after this battle is that the men from Scales, North Carolina brigade begin to desert in droves. And you can go back and look at the 16th North Carolina. Tremendous problems with desertion. One of the things that we're beginning to better understand about the war is how the weather and how environment impacted the way that these soldiers understood things. And so you got families writing back saying, hey, look, it hadn't rained in 6 months. And there's a terrible drought in North Georgia and western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee in 1862 and 1863. And these small farmers, not big planters, small farmers are having a really hard time in managing their farms from afar. And many of these men choose to go home, and they choose the allegiance of their family over the allegiance to the Confederate cause. So, but this is not to say that Scales men didn't fight well, because they are those communities.
Sure.
And they know that if they go home and they've been cowards, or if they've let their friends down, and these friend networks, these small level networks are very, very important for cohesion, and that's a lot of what keeps these guys going, because they keep going through the rest of the war. They've just lost a lot of their men to desertion. Sure. But on the afternoon of July 1st, they're fighting here side by side, and they're making the final push to drive the United States forces off of Seminary Ridge. It's a pretty dramatic story. Back off to where we were earlier today is a concentration of 21 cannon manned by the gunners of Wainwright's artillery brigade. Okay. And they stretch from about the north end of the seminary, or the north end of the seminary, all the way to Chambersburg Road. The guns are lined up about 5 yards apart. That's a third of the distance that's normal by regulation.
Yeah,
so you have a heavy concentration of artillery. You have guns across the road that are firing across this field obliquely. And when Scales' men come across the top of the ridge here, they say that they're met with a blizzard of grape shot and shell that staggers the line even as they come across the top of the ridge. They make it down the swale, they make it down to the bottom of the swale and begin to head back up, and they're pinned down. Somewhere between the bottom of the swale here where the ground gets kind of rough looking, and about 100 yards ahead is where they stop. There's several accounts of how close they got to the Union line, between 200 and 50 yards. Depends on whose account you do read. But they stop. The left regiment of Perrin's brigade stops. And they're being blasted by the artillery fire, and they're beginning to take infantry fire from behind the barricade of rails where Roy Stone's Bucktail Brigade, the remnants of that brigade are, where the remnants of the Iron Brigade are, the remnants of Biddle's Brigade are behind that barricade, and they put out a withering fire. Abner Perrin, who commands the South Carolina Brigade here, says it's the hottest infantry fire that he experienced during the entire war. And that's saying a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because,
absolutely.
McGowan's, Gregg's brigade had been at some of the hottest spots of the entire war. Mm-hmm. And so what they encountered here was pretty dramatic. The 14th South Carolina stops about where we're standing. The 1st South Carolina is crossing a fence. They come across the fence disorganized. And what does Abner Perrin do? The colonel of the 14th South Carolina, who is now commanding the brigade for all of 6 weeks, he rides his horse out in front. He rides his horse out in front of the brigade. He gets the 14th South Carolina up and going. He notices down to the south a gap in the Union line. He gives the orders to the 12th and 13th South Carolina to march obliquely towards the Samuel Simon Schmucker house at the intersection of the Fairfield Road.
Pat,
and he sends the 1st South Carolina obliquely across this field. So now the direction of the attack, and this is where the final breakthrough is going to be made. The 14th South Carolina advances directly on the rail barricade and that you can see at the edge of the woods. The 1st South Carolina moves obliquely, and before the defenders behind the barricade really knew what was happening, the 1st South Carolina is on their flank and they're firing almost point blank down the end of the Union line. George McFarland of the 151st Pennsylvania says that the Confederates fired 2 or 3 volleys on our flank before we knew that they were there. Farther to the south, the 12th and 13th South Carolina pushed through a gap between the end of the barricade of rails and Devon's cavalrymen, and the Union line begins to unfold at this point. And it begins a retreat back, a gauntlet back to Gettysburg and through town and back up onto Cemetery Hill. It's a pretty dramatic unfolding, but it's 4:30 in the afternoon now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gives us a wonderful overview, and again, I think it enlightens our view as to why exactly these men were doing what they were doing, and how, in some cases, their motives didn't necessarily match, which is a very important insight. Well, I think we've probably concluded our story.
I think so.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll be back on the battlefield on the 2nd and the 3rd. We're extraordinarily pleased to have had Dr. Darrell Black here. Darrell, again, is doing wonderful work at the Seminary Ridge Museum. We profoundly appreciate your time, Darrell.
Thank you for having me on.
It's
today.
always good
fun.
seeing you. Good friend and good colleague. So
right on.
until
Thank
next
you.
time.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Thanks.